I introduced the person who is going to be sharing his or her story. It's kind of hard to introduce Pat because everybody knows her, but I call her Nurse Pat. She is my go-to person when the doctors don't have the answers. Pat does, and I know she's been helpful to a lot of people here. How long have you been here, Pat?
Ever since it opened. Just
Oh,
a few.
pioneer.
Well, there were 13 people here when we came.
Pioneer Patch. Okay, and Pat has a wonderful story to share with us. I think it would be best if we wait until she has shared her story and ask questions. So please hold them until then. Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I want to just say that it's 33 minutes long, and that sounds like an endless time. But what happened was I misunderstood the directions, and I didn't realize she was going to be asking questions of me, and I'd answer them. So I, just to the task, went home and started typing my story. And I spent a lot of time doing it. So I asked her if I could read it instead of answering the questions. It's kind of complex. I'll be 90 next month, and with that age, you got a lot involved. So anyone who wants to do it, I'd take the other way to do it, though. I was born 3.2 miles from the Carrington at St. Francis Hospital, Evanston. I came home to my grandparents' homestead house in Northfield at Winnetka Avenue and Hap Road. No silver spoon found its way into my mouth. I had an older sister, Dolores, and 20 months after I was born, Laverne, nicknamed Bernie. This made a trio of girls. 2 more boys were born, Gerald and Joseph, 10 and 13 years later. We lived in my grandparents' home because they had purchased a farm in Union, Illinois around 1930, making this 5-bedroom home available to our family. It was the height of the Depression. My father was jobless, although he repaired slot machines for the mob. Sometimes. They did. I remember 2 men breaking into our home. I was only about 3 or 4 years old when this happened, and they wanted the slot machines from the basement, but my mother ran them off. I also remember not having food in the house. My Aunt Rose was a hairdresser. She worked at a salon in Winnetka, and her tips were often converted into food for dinner. 4 people occupied the upstairs bedrooms, 2 pilots from Sky Harbor Airport, and that closed in 1973. My Aunt Rose and Dad's sister Mary. We 3 girls had the large sun parlor off the living room. Incidentally, all 17 and a half years that I was home, the 3 sisters shared a bedroom. In later years, when we cruised together, we shared an oversized stateroom rather than being apart. I call myself a Depression baby, and as such, I'm still careful about how I spend my money, and my kids make fun of me. My mother came from a well-off working family with lots of property in the area. Mother attended Mollenkraut Girls Finishing School. The older aunts, my mother, my grandmother, all had full-length fur coats. And my grandmother had a big old Packard automobile she drove with gusto. New Trier West sits on the grandparents' original home property. My father from Quincy, Illinois, was the product of an abusive alcoholic father and a mother who passed away from cancer when he was 11. His father remarried 6 months later. This probably accounted for his dropout from high school at 14, almost 15. He became an industrial engineer on his own without formal education. He was written up twice in Forbes magazine about his engineering skills, and in 1959 was Texas's most prominent engineer. He was an early pilot, mechanic, carpenter, and man of all trades. He was the architect and contractor for 2 of our homes. He had his downside by he was a womanizer and being gone most of all of our girls' growing up years. I became aware of this consciously when I was in the 6th grade. In 1937, we moved to Vancouver, Washington. 6 months later to Seattle, Washington, all in the name of finding work. After 9 months, my grandparents sent money for us to return to their farm. There I attended a one-room schoolhouse. I was in 1st grade, my sister in 2nd, and my uncle was in 8th grade, all in the same room. Some students, I remember, rode their horses to school. Following the farm, Glenview was our home for a while, then Glencoe, and finally we moved into a rental house of my grandparents. I attended school at Saints Faith, Hope, and Charity in Winnetka. I was not of the class of most of those students. The years we lived in Illinois, my sisters and I spent all the time we could at my grandparents' farm. My mother found a job working as a waitress at Scarlett's nightclub. I think it was Northbrook or somewhere close to there. Many of Al Capone's men frequented this night spot, and tips were abundant. My mom bought a new Chevy automobile purchased with those tips just before we moved to San Francisco. A friend's 17-year-old daughter took care of us while she worked, as Dad was gone. In 1942, 5th grade and 10 years old, we moved to San Francisco. My father was then working for the federal government. He was responsible for redesigning all of the peacetime manufacturing in the 7 western states into wartime production. My brother Joe came into the world a few months after we arrived in San Francisco. Once we got settled and I was over the trauma of yet another school, I found I loved San Francisco. St. Monica School, riding the California streetcar, Girl Scouts, going to the Young People's Symphony, the Geary Movie Theater, where we attended a double feature, news, comic shorts, and The Lone Ranger or some other serial, almost every Saturday. Playing jacks on the concrete table in the park, trading playing cards, and oh my good friends. Also, World War II was at full blast during those years, and we saw military everywhere we went. I remember clearly, though, the Thanksgiving Day we were informed that my 22-year-old Uncle Bill had been shot down over the South Pacific and declared missing in action. We lived across the street from the Presidio in San Francisco, a military park, but then it was all for business. Dolores, Bernie, and I would sit on a wall in that park and watch the military transport vehicles full of men. We thought we might find Bill among those men, for we loved him dearly. Both my sister Dolores and I had a lot of responsibility those years toward my baby brother Joe. San Francisco lasted for 3 long years, and now we were moving again. This time, Phoenix. I felt so embarrassed when I stood up to answer a question, and all the kids laughed, for this was cowboy land and no standing up to answer questions. I had worn hats and gloves for church, the symphony, and everything was rather formal in San Francisco, while Phoenix was still the Wild West. I was so disturbed by this move and new school. Every day I went into the girls' bathroom, locked myself in a cubicle, and cried. This lasted for over a month, and I was suffering and no one in the world even knew. Obviously, this half of the 8th grade was not a happy time. And then it was only one semester at North Phoenix High School. And then again we moved to Tempe, about 7 miles from Phoenix. But again, a new start. One lovely human who became my girlfriend took me under her wing, and my 2.5 years in Tempe were fun-filled. I was an awful teenager when I was told we were moving to York, Pennsylvania, just before my senior year in high school. My sister had been able to finish her high school year in Tempe. Why couldn't I? My mother ended up slapping my face that summer for being rude and sassy to her, and she was correct, especially since I had such a good time my senior year, and even began to believe I might have a brain because I had missed so much with all the moving around. Dating was with groups of friends, including boys, much more fun than the pairing off that had been done in Arizona. I had a date for our senior prom, a beautiful white organdy gown that I had begged off my mother more than I should have. It was much too expensive, and then it rained, and my beautiful dress was a soppy mess. I couldn't tell you specifically why I became a nurse. I played nurse with my sisters often as a child. I was forced to make an early college decision as my parents were going to be moving once again, and I did want to be near them. They were going to California, so I chose to go back to San Francisco for college. Little did I know they would end up in Houston, Texas, for the remainder of their lives. They even stole a couple of my adult children to become Texans, and 2 grandchildren and great-grandchildren are there in Texas to this day. I loved my nursing school days. It was an arduous time, for we worked 6.5 days a week, 50 weeks a year, for 3 solid years. And our college classes were taken at the University of San Francisco, and the Jesuit professors did all they could to educate our brains. My senior year, I actually got a private room all to myself. It felt amazing. I was a reasonable student, but I was an excellent nurse. Who could study after a 12-hour workday anyhow? And that included our classes. The Christmas I entered college, I met my best friend's first cousin, a handsome 6'2", broad-shouldered poster board for the Marine Corps. He had been a Washington, D.C. honor guard during his Marine days. I thought he was rather conceited, and I didn't want anything to do with him. 1.5 years later, though, I fell head over heels in love with him as he persisted in winning over the house mothers of our dorm. The house mother would call my room saying he was such a nice man, why wouldn't I want to go out with him or at least see him? Eventually, I did. My best friend's parents were his aunt and uncle, and they had wanted this to happen for several years already. We married 2 weeks after I finished college. He was finishing his last year of engineering at Notre Dame. So whither thou goest, I go became the motto of the day. And I was moving once again. After South Bend, it was to Barstow, California, where he worked for the Santa Fe Railroad as a supervisor in the roundhouse. I worked in a 15-bed emergency hospital where anyone needing health care after an auto accident on the road to Las Vegas had to come back to Barstow. I learned a lot about trauma in those years and who you could save and who you couldn't, mainly. We also delivered the town's babies, most of them anyhow. If there were too many babies, they went into the dresser drawers, and that happened many times. Rather primitive, but it worked. Then we moved to Gallup, New Mexico, and after that, back to Barstow. And finally, we lived 5 years in New Mexico. During these mobile years, we produced 2 sons and 4 daughters. After the 6th child in 1964, we were transferred to Chicagoland. Joe was in charge system-wide of the refrigerated cars and containers. The transfer became a horror story. I was almost 7 months pregnant, and the day before the movers were coming, my water broke. I ended up in the hospital. Movie plans were canceled. You could barely see I was pregnant. The doctor said complete bed rest and try to hold this pregnancy. I don't know what he wanted me to do. I was told to eat 5,000 calories per day so the baby would put on weight. This lasted 2 weeks, and she was born, placed in a respirator for she was not breathing, although she weighed 5 pounds. No nails, fingernails, or toenails, eyelashes, or brows. Swallowing and breathing weren't coordinated, and she choked every time we tried to feed her. After 4 weeks, I brought her home, only to realize all 5 other children had come down with the measles. Joe had already returned to Chicago, and my mother-in-law, after 20 days, had left for home in Topeka, Kansas. To further complicate things, Megan was born with a tumor on her hand and a significant hernia which needed timely surgery. Thank God for my good friends, as I got Megan to Albuquerque for the surgery, knowing the other children were in safe hands. The tumor would have to wait until we moved to Chicagoland, and is another story for another day. My vulnerability showed as we left Gallup. I couldn't face a goodbye with anybody. I packed the children in the car, and I drove to Albuquerque. No goodbyes, not even to my best friend. Joe would take the train when all was complete at the house. I cried off and on the 150 miles to Albuquerque. The children were gung-ho about our new adventure, and here I was crying. Once again, I felt completely alone, and no one cared. Regardless of how I felt, we did have a good life in Park Forest, with lots of friends and thriving children. Park Forest housed many University of Chicago professors, so the school district was great. A big field was behind our home for sports and snakes alike, and there was a big old snake pit that the boys had. The children attended a Catholic school, and this accounted for many of my days as school nurse and librarian. Of course, the Girl Scouts needed a leader, and dances needed a chaperone. I left that one to Joe and the fathers. Joe and I belonged to the Christian Family Movement, and he was on the parish council. In January of 1967, I cared for 2 girls, 5 and 3, while their divorced mother taught high school. These were fun-filled children, and I was caring for my 2 youngest girls anyhow. School ended, and the mom asked if I would take them in the fall. Late August, Liz came to see me about arrangements for the fall. About 4 hours later, the police called, asking me if I would take all 5 of her children. Liz had been shot 5 times by her husband, and then he killed himself in front of 2 of the children. Liz fought for her life and was in the hospital for 3.5 months. Yes, for those months, our family increased to 11 children under 12 years of age. All our friends helped me, and one kind human brought after-dinner treats for the kids every single night. I returned to nursing when my youngest was 2. I worked the 3 to 11 shift every other weekend, but I was yearning to work more, but I had a lot to do at home. When Megan was in 2nd grade, that's the youngest, I started full-time. I returned to college to get a master's degree in nursing and a minor in management. I raised 6 independent children. I read Ms. Maria Montessori's book on raising children. Her premise was never do anything for a child they could do for themselves. And believe me, I didn't. I did a lot of things for them to be able to succeed, but I didn't play with my children. They played with each other. By 5th grade, homework was each child's responsibility. One could ask for help, but by 15 or 16 years of age, they were fully responsible for conducting their lives. Neither Joe nor I ever told a child what time to be at home. Each one developed reasonable expectations of themselves and us as parents. Today, all 6 of them are doing well, successful, kind, but particularly generous. With no family around, our friends became that missing element. This was true of many neighbors. No family near, so most of the holidays were spent with all these friends in our 20 by 24 foot den we had added on to our home. Picnics during the summertime for all in the field, horseshoe pits, baseball, and lots of foods that everyone made. Friday evenings were our night out, dinner with 3 other couples and a couple of hours of bridge. I never left my children until the oldest one was 18 and Megan was 8 years old. The worst month of my life was after the 4th child, Colleen, got an infected cellulitis on her cheek. That's just a big infection. She had been burned on her cheek. I had to bribe her with 50-cent pieces to accept her penicillin shots. The result of this staph infection was everyone, except me, including Joe, got boils and carbuncles. The boils were everywhere and anywhere, one by one, to the pediatrician or doctor for lancing. Every pajama, underwear, clothes, bed linen had to be washed every single day. The room sprayed with Lysol, the cribs and other items washed down. This scenario occupied my life for a whole month. My best friend was a divorced woman, Kay. She lived 2 doors away with her 4 children. She was diagnosed with brain cancer. Her youngest daughter, Jennifer, practically lived at our home. As a matter of fact, we used to go up to my grandmother's in Northfield from Park Forest almost every Sunday, and Jennifer always came with us. My grandmother thought she was one of ours. The last 6 months of Kay's life, Jennifer kind of moved in with us. When Kay died, Jennifer lived with us and became one more daughter. A year later, her long-lost father showed up. He had found out that Jennifer had a trust fund. He took her to, this gets me just awful because I can picture her sitting in the back of the car looking out. He took her to California, where his absence left her without food at times. Jennifer never left my life, as I talk with her at least twice a week now. And Phil and I have been to see her several times. She lives in Florida and has been adopted by Phil, as well as, of course, my own. I feel like she's one of my kids. A woman with 2 children spent Christmas with us. Her husband had a heart attack while traveling through Chicagoland. The hospital chaplain called me to see if it was possible for them to come to our home. My children adjusted their Christmas toys, and those children had presents. Some people bring home lost puppies. I seem to attract lost people, as several others found way into our home during the years. About 1969, I began to realize my husband Joe was rather quiet. His humor and lightheartedness were rarely present. He went to work, helped with homework, and whatever else was asked of him, but I could see his energy was dwindling. He saw his doctor and he placed him on some tranquilizers, and I sure didn't think that was the problem. Finally, his doctor, who suffered with depression himself, sent Joe to a psychiatrist where he was diagnosed with depression. Antidepressants were prescribed, and a couple of weeks later, the old Joe reappeared, and I felt relief. Months went by, and Joe called me at work to say he had a sinus infection with 102 fever. Antibiotics got rid of the sinus problem, but depression had set in again. To the psychiatrist, antidepressants, but this time the doctor wanted to see him once a week. The depression lasted for a couple of weeks, and we returned to normal again. This scenario repeated itself through 5 years of time. Joe never missed a day of work, no matter how he felt. At this time, antidepressants were prescribed until the depression lifted. Not like today when a person is kept on the antidepressants maybe for the rest of their life. I could see Joe slowly declining as a happy father and husband. My 13-year-old daughter called me at work to say, "Dad's car is here, but I can't find Dad." She called me back a few minutes later to say her dad was hanging in the garage. For some reason, I had told only this bright 13-year-old the complete story of her dad on Monday, and this was Thursday. His suicidal feelings during the past years, his trips to the psychiatrist, my worries and my fear. She even explained to the police officer all about his history. Unfortunately, suicide isn't an acceptable cause of death. You could die from 5 years of struggle with cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's, an auto accident. There's something suspicious about suicide. The police officer's first question to me was, were Joe and I getting along? Was Joe having difficulty at work? And other ridiculous questions. Asked me the story of this lovely man's demise, how beloved he was and how needed he was in our family, church, and community, let alone his work. Rather, this is the story of a terrible disease, often genetically transferred, which ended tragically. His mother had been in a psychiatric hospital for 1 year for depression when he was small. When I called Dr. Korzanowski to tell him of Joe's death, he said to me, "Pat, that is why I had you sit in on Joe's sessions with me. After 40 years of psychiatry, you kind of know those patients who will end their own lives." My first thought after hearing of his death was relief. I had seen Joe suffer for so long. I carried that fearful gnaw in my gut for too long. I didn't realize I had carried the responsibility for the family's happiness during those years, protecting the children from his disease. At Joe's death, 3 children were in college, and 11, 13, and 16-year-old girls were still at home. Grief is a horrible response for the price of loving someone for 22 years. I was like a person without legs, learning to walk differently. I had never been on my own, my parents' home, a strict nursing college, and so soon after college, marriage with our large family. Grief was with me constantly. I love Helen Hayes' quote about her grief. "You're crazy, and everyone knows it except you." I didn't have a divorced, let alone widowed friend. I was again suffering, and no one knew it. If I could see my internal devices, I was terrified. I was helping my children with the trauma of their dad's death as best I could, needing to work full-time to support them, for Joe's large insurance policy would not pay after a suicide death at that time. The daughter who found her dad needed me. I kept her out of school to travel with me as I did some of my work. She made a photo album of her dad, wrote about him, and we spent time talking about him. For me, the joy had gone out of our home. Music had always been in our home. But for 10 years, you never heard a note. Maybe it was even longer. A moving song had me in tears, and I couldn't handle that and carry on with what I needed to do. My children and sometimes myself get caught up with his lack of presence, even to this day at weddings, graduations, and other happy events. 45 years later, and grief can kick itself back in. I changed jobs as people seemed to feel sorry for me, where I had worked for 17 years. I even started a business on the side, teaching critical care nursing and trauma nursing based on my ER years. These courses were for experienced critical care nurses. Somewhere along the way, a medical education company asked me to present some seminars for them. I continued to teach my courses and now had a partner. And between us, we presented the courses. And I presented over 2,000 full-day seminars in all 50 of the United States. And this included Alaska and Hawaii. I taught in Anchorage 3 times and Honolulu 3. Around 2 years after Joe's death, I was asked on a date. This is the worst part of everything. I felt like a fool and didn't have any idea how to act. I wasn't comfortable dating when I was young, and now it was absolutely absurd. As time went by, I did date quite a bit, but I didn't date long with any individual. I wasn't interested in remarriage, and certainly not to anyone with children. Ha ha. I also found men were dating to have sex and to find someone to take care of them or them and their children. Eventually, I went to a meeting called Widows and Widowers Without Partner. It was there I learned about a 48-hour weekend for divorced and widowed, where a person could work through their grief. I went, and after that weekend, which had been a wide awakening thing for me, I decided to take the training to work as a team member for the beginning experience. I learned an unbelievable amount about coping and not coping with grief. I did my part as a team member for 16 years. Helping those who come behind going through grief has many unheralded rewards. I wouldn't give up those years for anything. Phil and I worked at the same hospital. He was director of the respiratory department, and I, an ER nurse, med-surg nurse, critical care, coronary, head nurse, and supervisor. Eventually finding my real calling, education. Phil's wife had been killed in an accident caused by a drunk driver 1 year before Joe's death. We were friends. We never dated, but we did go to a couple of musical events together. One time, Phil and I went to a musical review, and both of us sat there crying through most of the evening. We were both still grieving. We had coffee occasionally and talked. Phil is 7 years younger than I, has 4 children, at that time 8 to 16 years of age. The children made Phil a no marriage candidate, absolutely. I let him know this several times. Phil was single 6 years and I was 5. I still have the letter I wrote to him saying I could never marry a man with children who still needed raising. But he was a relentless suitor. Not 1, but 24 roses arrived at my workplace one day. A porcelain Yadro figurine of Madame Butterfly was a gift after we attended Madame Butterfly at the Opera House. But lo and behold, I did marry him against my own counsel. We all do silly things. We were married in Park Forest with only our best friends in attendance, just a couple, none of the kids even. The following Saturday, there was a huge picnic celebration with family and friends. My son from Houston brought 40 pounds of shrimp from the Gulf of Mexico. We had live music and a great time. When the wedding festivities were over, we had to face the job of raising these additional children together. Phil's oldest chose to return to their grandparents' house. He probably saw me and didn't want to deal with me. It was no easy job helping to raise Phil's children. For 5 years, his parents had lived with Phil and the children. His parents were from Sicily, and Italian customs prevailed. The children were addicted to TV. The boys didn't know how to care for themselves. Grandma did everything, for they were male Italian boys. And daughter Mary was also the typical Italian girl, doing for all these males in this household. The one thing going for us was I loved his children. Mischief was the name of PJ and Stephen. When I couldn't, and Stephen this day is a principal of a Catholic school up in Madison, Wisconsin, but oh my God. When I couldn't cope with all that went on in our household, his children, my work, home, we separated for 1 year. Phil took the boys, I kept Mary. We survived as we were such good friends, like we are to this day. When all the children were raised, we traveled. I spent my early retired years volunteering at a Dutch Reformed thrift shop, about 16 years worth. I was cashier for a long time, and when I couldn't stand up for long periods, I took over cleaning and getting shoes ready for sale. A humble position, but I loved every minute. And I made wonderful friends. I rejoined the Park Forest Nurses Club, where former hospital friends participated. I belonged, but the most important was I belonged to a Take-Off Pound Sensibly group for 22 years. These 50 women became my special family. We met every week, and 2 different card games and all kinds of dates to do things together came from that group. We all did various things, except for a member's death. There wasn't an opening in this group for 7 years. No one left the group. That's how close we were. In 1987, we downsized from our 6-bedroom, 3-bath home. It was time for every one of those kids to take their treasures that were stored. We needed to be out of Park Forest, and the 2 youngest needed to be in a better high school. Stephen started high school, but he was feeling like I had felt. He wanted to be back where his friends were, and he spent his last semester at a friend's home. He was 18, and we couldn't say too much. Sadly, our very bright PJ, who I even homeschooled for a semester due to his learning difficulties, dropped out of high school. And that was with my brother-in-law, who was an assistant principal's suggestion, because he was just occupying a seat. Later, he did get his GED. It's yet another story, and I'm not going there. Now, Philip is a great dancer. I always wanted to be able to dance, but never even tried. Around 2000, we embarked upon a dancing journey. 1 or 2 friend couples, Phil and I, attended the Park District's dance classes each week. The key to learning to dance is no different than piano or anything else, practice. And we practiced every day for 15 minutes. And I won't say that Phil did it willingly, but he did do it. We went on many cruises and danced our feet off late into the night. We became proficient, and other cruisers even like to watch Phil and I dance. You will never know how much I miss dancing since my legs are failing. In April 2018, we did our last cruise on a 6,000 passenger Harmony of the Sea. It was wonderful, but that phase of our lives was over. You might see us dance if I take 1 or 2 or more pain pills before it ends. But for the major part, cruising and dancing are only memories. It was 2018, we were in our beautiful Tinley Park home. I was being asked to give up my roots to move to the Carrington. That was too much to ask of me. 4 of our daughters live up here on the north side, and we were at 163rd in Harlem, an hour-plus drive to any of their homes. It took 2 years of talking before I accepted the thought of looking for a retirement facility. When we finally said we could look, our daughter Mary Kay had all kinds of brochures for us to review. As I recall, 3 daughters, Phil and I, came here to look at the 2 different apartments that were available to just view. And finally it was a yes. Moving to the Carrington could have been the removal of my toenails. I found it beyond difficult. my roots would be gone and my connections to so many people would end. Once here, I couldn't bear the thought of going back for any occasion, as I knew it would cause too much pain. To this day, I've never been back, although it's only an hour away. Every 2 months, I write a group letter to 24 former friends. I talk on the phone and some write, but I have never gone back. The sheer uprootedness is beginning to subside. It's not that I don't like it here, I love it here. It's just that I need in my soul to be connected. As things are, I shall live out my days 3.2 miles from where I was born, here at the Carrington. This is home to me. I've made a lot of friends who I cherish, participate as much as I can, and appreciate all we have available to do. Given time, should I live that long, I will totally feel secure. That's it. Thank you. I'll answer any question.
I have one.
What's your question?
Seems to me,
What's your mic?
I guess, I need my mic. Seems to me, you mentioned when we talked that you taught in 50, you traveled in 50 states
Yep.
to teach. Is that correct?
Yes, I taught in all 50 states, the smallest and the largest. It just, the company that I work for, they presented seminars and they told me where to go and I went. I traveled with a coordinator who set up the room, etc. But yes, it was hard work, but I wouldn't want to do it today with all that goes on with the TSA and all of that.
So that was for a company,
Yes.
correct? But you also had a partner, and didn't you do something like that with your partner?
My partner really kept the courses going. She and I kind of divided up the courses that we taught. It's a very big lack in nursing. A secondary review of all that you learned in nursing school that was physically important for the patients we care for. And this partner, Debbie, who became another one of my daughters, and I just discovered how little basic fundamentals like understanding atmospheric pressure, which ventilators run because of changes in atmospheric pressure. So we taught all those principles or dynamics that critical care nurses need. Who has a question?
I have another one.
Okay.
And it's all yours, okay? I believe you told me that during your years of education, you attended 13 schools.
I think I got most all the movings in the talk, but I know I went to Avoca School. Where is that? Winnetka?
Yes.
But I don't have a house to go with that in my mind.
Okay, so I have a follow-up to that.
What's that?
I can't imagine, having been an educator and having had children move into my school district, which happens to be Lincolnwood, haven't gone too far. Most of the children, when they first moved, actually went through periods of anger, depression,
Grief.
Now you made 13 moves. Is this what you went through each time?
Yes, and nobody really realizes kids are kind of cruel to each other. It's sad that we don't teach, that somehow that kindness doesn't come through. Once in a while, as I did when I started in Tempe, Arizona, somebody just took me under her wing, as I said, and made it easy for me. But I never had that happen in all of my moving anywhere. And I don't know why teachers weren't aware of how hard. Here I am sitting up here, but I was very shy. If you saw a picture of me when I was young, I never smiled. I was very sad. You can't jar a kid out of school that many times. And one place I'd go, they'd already taught something that I had learned, and then I would miss something else, and you just don't get a good education. And you're afraid, I was afraid anyhow, that I'd say the wrong thing, and I did. And then the kids would laugh. Because I remember one time, it was his and hers, male and female, and I didn't understand even the question, let alone what the answer was. And everybody just laughed. But I understand it today, but at that time, with a little kid's heart and soul, you don't know that.
Okay, your turn.
Anybody have a question?
I have many more questions, but it's being a teacher, I always have questions. Yes. Do you need the mic?
Maybe my wife.
Where? Okay. Oh. Okay.
Pat, could you please tell me when you traveled at first with small children, did you, or even when you were a youngster, did you travel by car or by train? You know, when you were going from California to New Mexico, what mode of transportation did your mom and you and your sis take?
I remember when we went to Washington State, first to Vancouver, Washington. I remember as we went through the mountains, the car hit a hawk, and I was terrified watching as we drove along after that something else would attack the car. But no, it was always by car.
By automobile.
And after my first husband and I married, of course, he had railroad passes. And this is hard to think of, but my kids were really responsible human beings. And I can remember putting them on the train in Joliet, and my husband would talk to the conductor, and they were 10 and 12, and they took the train all the way to Houston by themselves. And I would do that with them again today based on how they conducted themselves. They just knew their way around in the world. And I just believe the more you trust your kids, the more they trust back and forth and more responsible they become. That was the hard thing with Phil's children, is I could never trust them except to be in bed when they were supposed to be in bed and to be at mealtime. They just couldn't get that toehold into being able to be able to trust them to do what they were supposed to do. Homework was always something to quarrel over, and I wasn't like that. I really think they tested me to the point that they wanted me to hit them, that it was like then they would be right, that I was the wicked old witch. But I never laid a hand on any child, mine or Phil's. And I loved them. I loved them very, very much. PJ, the youngest one, we used to sometimes at dinner time, we would read, if any of you've ever read an Og Mandino books, The Greatest Salesman on the Earth, they were selling popcorn for the Boy Scouts, and it was ridiculously expensive. And PJ was going to go out selling his popcorn, and he kept saying, well, if I get 9 no's, then I get a yes. So his way of handling it is when somebody would tell him no, he'd say, oh, that's wonderful, because then I'm that much closer to somebody saying yes. And then the people would buy his old popcorn. And he looked like a refugee child, he was so thin. And he was adorable, but between the two of them, what one thought couldn't think of, the other one did. They'd take apart bicycles but not put them together. They were Stephen, who was just adorable. The doorbell rang and there was the policeman with Stephen and the spray can of paint. And Stephen saying, "I didn't do it, Pat, I didn't do it." And the policeman saying he was spraying the pipes back in the field, the gas line. But he didn't do it as far as he was concerned. But the children are wonderful. And they all called me Pat. I never asked them to call me Mom, and it was never talked about. But all of them, even the oldest one, Marty, who went and stayed with his grandparents and finished high school with his grandparents home, in his grandparents' home, he calls me Mom to this day too. So somehow, I don't know, I won him over. Yes, Lynn.
When we moved very often with our children also, and how we handled it was we circled the wagon, which meant as a family unit, we were very close. And then as we felt more and more comfortable, then we'd branch out. And that seemed to work every time.
My children didn't have trouble making the friends. It was me who had trouble. And I just was afraid. That's all I can say, is I was afraid. And the kids, we had 48 kids on our block in Park Forest. You know, what was to be afraid of? Everybody was in the same boat with a bunch of kids and school and projects and everything else. Elaine, you started.
So I had the pleasure of hearing you one morning, you talking about your grandmother.
Oh, my grandmother, yes.
And so I think to myself, I don't know how to question this, but I envision you to be a spiritual person, or maybe a religious person, or maybe if anybody knows footprints. Because everything that you went through, I believe that had some higher power, something had to be there to help you.
Oh.
Because your story is extraordinary, and I don't know. I don't know if the right word is being religious or spiritual, or this is a background and upbringing from your grandmother.
Well, I think I gained that inner strength from my grandmother, who I loved very much and who was a big part of my life, and who lived until a year before my husband's death, so I was close to her as an adult. But I think her spiritual life did transfer to me. I went to Catholic grammar school, high school, and college. I do not belong to the Catholic Church anymore. I have nothing against it at all. I just kind of say I outgrew it. I didn't need somebody to tell me, give me rules and regulations, but I rely upon my faith. I just think, I hate to say it sounds so, whatever. I like to say I opened my mouth and God comes out, because I really feel that the strength that you get I can't even begin to tell you all of the little things. One of my sons brought a hitchhiker home one night when it was raining cats and dogs, and here's this strange man in our home sleeping overnight. Somebody with a broken arm in the ER, he and another guy came to our house, and Joe took him, got him to a plane to go back home. It just was part of how we live. And I don't know how that happened. It just was. And I do think my grandmother set a big example for that, because she always had lots of people, if anybody that heard my talk in church that one day. No, I have a really strong faith life. Whatever you want to call that power greater than ourselves, it's there. For me, anyhow. And I trust it, I rely upon it, and anybody that knows me very well, my thing about everything is if nobody dies, it's okay. It doesn't matter if you drop the most precious thing in the world and it breaks. Nobody died, so it's okay. And that's what I always thought. And then my husband dies. And I just kept thinking, but that doesn't happen. Suicide's an awful thing to encounter. That happened, his suicide was about 11 o'clock in the morning, and about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, knock, knock, knock on our front door, and the coach lived down the block, and there was his wife at the front door. And she said, "Pat, I need to talk with you." And she said, "You remember last month when we were downstate when my husband's father died? He'd had a heart attack." And I said, "Oh yeah, of course I remember." And she said, "Well, it wasn't. He was a farmer. He had hung himself in the barn." And she said, "I've never told a person until you." That's what I hear when I'm willing to share my story. Other people have had it. The woman who used to do my hair, when I said about my husband, she said, "I've never told another human being except the immediate family knew it. Her sister committed suicide." It's such a horrible thing, and yet we hide it, so that my best friend, who I ended up knowing for over 50 years before she passed away, that lived in Park Forest, we were nurses together. She said to me, "Pat, you're so mean to make Joe go to a psychiatrist." Now, this was a woman in the medical profession who was angry with me. First of all, I didn't do it. He did it himself. And that's how little she understood. So how could you expect other people to understand? And he went to work every single day. So it wasn't like he stayed home. He just was an extremely mature human being that was able to carry on in spite of how he felt. And his last thing he did was write a prayer asking God for help. And that was the answer, unfortunately. But our answers aren't what we want. It's what happened, and that's what it was. And we had walked in the field. His death was on a Thursday morning. Wednesday night, Joe and I had walked through the field behind our house, and I just was, "Oh God, don't let him suffer anymore." It wasn't the way I wanted it to be. He was out of pain and I was glad. That's all I can say. I really was relieved. Not just for my own sake. All of you who are caretakers know how hard it is to take care of somebody endlessly. And it's so hard for them, and it's so hard for you. And you struggle through. He always told me when he was suicidal, but I couldn't do anything to make it better. No matter how much we talk, no matter, it's a physical thing, and we think of it as something mixed up and crazy in our minds, but it isn't. It's a physical disease, just like cancer is a physical disease. But it carries the stigma. And look at all of these young people who have committed atrocities. And the paper makes, the newspaper and reporters, this man, they'd known he was ill and everything. What are you to do with these poor people who are mentally ill? I don't know. If anyone has a schizophrenic relative or child or niece or nephew, it is hell for those parents. And it was beyond, it was so difficult I didn't even realize how difficult it was. Because you're just prodding through each day. And somehow your foot does go there. Enough's enough.
Every one of you here, whether you realized it or not, have received a priceless gift by Pat sharing her story. You have the opportunity to open your mind and try to understand what mental illness can mean. And as you said, Pat, people don't talk about it.
No.
Can you believe there was a time, I remember way back in my own life, people didn't talk about cancer.
No, they didn't.
No, my mother had cancer, but they made it sound like something else. They didn't talk about it. Well, we've come a long way now with the C word, but we need to go a lot farther as far as understanding the challenges of mental illness, the challenges to the person who's experiencing, the challenge to the people around him or her, the people who love this person and want to help, the challenge to the medical profession.
Right. Thank God it's treated differently today. Bipolar's another one. I mean, I won't go there.
Are there more questions?
Anybody else? I'd be happy to answer.
I can't thank you enough. I truly consider this a gift.
Oh, thank you, Jackie.
You are one amazing, as the kids say, they use this word and it's so overused, awesome woman.
Awesome.
Who had a life of adjusting, constantly adjusting or not adjusting.
Not adjusting.
To all
is
the
more like
changes. And then being the adult who understood what it was like for someone to be lost or need help, and accept all these people into your life, into your home, into your life. And we thank Phil for sending more flowers and convincing Pat that the two of you could make a beautiful life together. This has been an amazing story. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate you being here. Now you know why I always go around.